Hi, I'm Skip Rizzo, and I direct the Medical Virtual Reality Lab at the University of Southern California Institute for Creative Technologies. And today on the show, we're going to talk about the use of VR to treat PTSD, even the kind you might experience as a leader. Then, hopefully, we'll get to talk a little bit about the future of leadership training and how much of it's going to take place in the metaverse. Finally, we'll discuss the double-edged sword that is AI and the reason that great leadership is needed in its application. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to part 2 of our delicious conversation with Dr. Skip Rizzo. He is an internationally recognized thought leader in his field and has been hailed by Polygon as one of the top 25 greatest innovators in the field of virtual reality. He's a clinical psychologist and director of medical virtual reality for the University of Southern California, among many other things. And in part 1 of the show, we talked a lot about, we started out by talking about how leadership training alone, it could make a vast difference in the context of VR. We talked about some of the illusions of what virtual reality is, and it looked kind of lame in the beginning, but it's very different now, and how there is this idea of I know it's fake, and then realizing that emotionally you're responding as if it's entirely real, even if the graphics are not particularly sophisticated. So that's pretty fascinating in and of itself. And then we talked about the therapeutic benefits of using VR, through clinical studies and research has been done, of using VR therapies particularly for PTSD, but for many other things as well, and how the fear was it's going to re-traumatize somebody, but the research and the science has backed up that is not the case at all. In fact, that over a long period of time, even the people who bail before they're done actually never go back and become worse than they were before. So we know it never makes people worse. It actually always helps to some degree. And if you walk it through to the end, will definitely make a significant difference. So Skip, let's go back to the beginning. We talked about, you had done this training with the university around inclusive, etc. And you talked about it not really stuck with you. And then you talked about with a 360 video being the fly on the wall for a training, completely different about what you were able to remember. So that brings us into the possibility of the science or the neuroscience of memory, which is a massive subject in itself. We won't go too much into it. But it also comes to something you and I were talking about before we started, which is we were talking about politics. You and I are both political people. And we were talking about, who inspires a group, who inspires like that inspirational piece. And that sometimes the person who inspires is not really the person who's qualified, but they look good or they're inspirational. And so we realize that at a human condition level, that is also important. So are we inspired by a VR character from The Simpsons, or, not really, but by a VR character versus being inspired by a therapist that we've created deep rapport with, who has genuine empathy and compassion, etc. Talk to us about that part, because, we just said the inspiration is very real and it's an important part, and it creates that connection.
I think we're at a point with interaction with virtual humans, representations of humans, whether they're in human form or, some other imaginary form in some way. I think we're at the point where we can foster credible interactions that allow people to suspend disbelief as they engage with the character over time, so that they, again, frontal lobe's always knowing they're talking to a piece of software. But as they start getting credible answers and the interaction goes back and forth, they start acting as if it's the real thing. I'll give you an example of this. I have a great video on my YouTube channel, by the way, of one of our very first virtual patient training applications for medical students. And
Mm-hmm.
it was a female patient who had, and the only thing that the MD had was an index card that said referred by mother, a teenager doesn't want to go back to school, doesn't want to leave her room. That was it. So
Mm-hmm.
this clinician, I've got this great video. The clinician says, "Hey, how are you doing today?" And you've got this very primitive character with limited gesture, hardly any facial expression, saying, I just, I'm not sure if I want to be here." And the doc goes, "Okay, well, can you tell me a little bit more? Is there anything specific?" And at first, you see the doc has this smile, like he's talking to this very impoverished piece of software. But then the character starts giving him credible answers. And it was, decent voice recognition and natural language processing that went on with this. And all of a sudden he's leaning in and he's looking and doing all the things that you would want a good clinician in an initial intake interview for this particular problem. And it turns out he's providing reflections, he's following up on questions in a thoughtful way, he's not uh, being blaming or shameful, shaming the patient in any way, really supportive. And eventually it gets to the point where the virtual client says, well, I was in a car with Eddie and he tried to kiss me. And when I wouldn't kiss him, he pulled out a knife and he threatened me. And it's like, and you saw the video of the face of the trainee, the medical student, like, and followed up with an empathetic, reframing and response. And it was just, and that was when it dawned on me, if you have this kind of credible dialogue and there's a specific purpose for it, people will engage with these characters in a way that they actually get better with training. We've just published in JAMA Open Network a randomized controlled trial for motivational interview training with virtual patients that actually showed with VA clinicians that when they actually did a live interview with a standardized live actor patient, and it was blindly reviewed by experts in motivational interviewing, that the additive training of virtual patient interaction, actually constructing your words and responding to the patient in this simulation, that they got better. It transferred to the real world. And that's going from 2007 to 2020. Um, the credibility of the characters has evolved, and particularly in voice recognition and natural language processing. We got ways to go with some of the facial
Of
expression,
course.
some of the gestures of the characters. There's work being done in that area. But what that showed us was on this very constrained path of clinical training, that we could engage people and they would start to interact like it's a real thing and they would learn something from it. So the next level, getting closer to your question, is, well, what about flipping it around? Can we
Mm-hmm.
build characters, virtual characters that serve the role of the therapist, and now you're the client? And I'll go right to the top level right now. It will
Yeah.
happen at some point, and there'll be a strong case made for AI therapists. They're always available 24/7. They have encyclopedic knowledge of every clinical condition and every therapeutic approach. They never forget a damn thing you say to them in the engagement, and then can do it, deep level machine learning analytics in the background and tie a therapeutic process to something you said 5 sessions ago and update it to what you're saying now. Tremendous power in that.
Mm-hmm.
But what's missing? And everybody that's lost their job to a machine is probably going to say the same thing, but it's the human decision making, it's the human empathy, it's the human connection, it's the social support of another human understanding you. And I think those are powerful things. And I made the case on the front end about why AI might replace therapists, but to get to my final answer here, I'm not sure it will, because I think there's an evolved thing about connection with other people, the interdependence of people in groups for survival, going back, to primordial times.
Yeah,
And
tribal.
it's in there where the ultimate trust in changing yourself, I think you have to have that clinician loop. Now, is there a place for AI?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Filling in gaps where there isn't a clinician available, or a person is loath to go to a real person. Their clinical condition involves maybe their feelings of shame or
Yes.
regret, or they just don't want to reveal themselves. So can you build stepping stones that prepare a person towards that live interaction with
Well,
a
one of the things you
therapist?
talked about, and actually at the conference that you and I were both at, Deepak referenced it, is that one of the things they're finding is that in some cases, people are actually preferring a virtual therapist over a real therapist. And I had suggested that's because of the projection of shame. Not that the therapist is shaming them, but the fear that you will shame me. Whereas a VR therapist, I can somehow trust that a VR therapist won't shame me, but I'm running computation is in my mind that even if you're not saying it, you're thinking that I'm a piece of shit, right?
This is a cognitive distortion of mind
Exactly.
reading.
Yeah, exactly.
They're always
Right.
mind reading, the
Exactly.
therapist thinks I'm a real idiot here. Or
Exactly. So, that for me was a very interesting piece that there are applications today where this not only is beneficial but is necessary, um, if only, and as you said, if only as a runway to interaction with a real person. The other side of this that I want to come to, because there's a lot of talk about the metaverse, and we think of that often as being a Facebook thing, but it's not. That's just the name they used. Metaverse has been around for a long time, and here's my concern, Skip, and I really want to hear your point of it. You and I are old enough that we were told, don't sit so close to the telly, you'll ruin your eyes. Right?
yep.
Right? And then, if you were a Gen Xer, you played games. I didn't, but you played Game Boy or whatever it was. I was before that generation. And, people were worried about that just as they were worried about the kids who were sitting in their basement playing Dungeons and Dragons. Okay. And then the evolution of that has become now, you go to a restaurant and it looks like everybody's praying because their head is down, but they're not praying. They're
That's
on their
because
bloody
of phone.
phones. Right. And one of the things that I had said in a conference that I was at recently is I said, I believe that you will be praying for the day when your kid is on the phone in the living room. Because just as we were told, don't watch too much telly, parents today are saying, let's have a family time. Let's sit around and watch the movie together, as opposed to you being in your room looking at 2 screens or 3 screens. And I think that as we move forward into a virtual reality metaverse world, there's a chance, a pretty good chance, that if your life is miserable, you can create a virtual reality that's not so miserable. So maybe you're a lonely, out of shape, not so attractive individual who is stunningly good looking, who lives in a mansion in the metaverse, and you may be living in poverty and emaciation in the real world. But in that world, you can be all that in a bag of chips. And the danger is that even though I cognitively, prefrontal cortex may know I'm in an imaginary world, the limbic system is creating the bond with virtual people. I've got a community, but I'm dying of loneliness and of the lack of connection in the real world, but I'm fooling myself into it's real. And so now we move into the world of now um, the hypothalamus, the mood and appetite center, the addictive centers of the brain, and now I'm addicted to my virtual world. I'm actually a full-blown addict in that virtual world. I'm not taking drugs, but I'm creating a neural cascade of drugs inside of my own coconut, where I'm outside of reality. I'm having a better life in that world, and now I don't want to leave. That is my concern with the metaverse reality, as opposed to this wonderful therapeutic process you're talking about.
You know, there's so many points to unpack in what you just said.
Sorry for backing up the truck there, mate.
I thought of about 30 stories,
Right.
in the process of it. I'm going to pick one though. I mean, first
Right.
off, look at Ready Player One.
Right.
This is where, the context of the real world was so horrific. It was kind of a post-apocalyptic kind of a living environment, no attention to pollution and global,
Right.
climate change, all that stuff. And so the metaverse provided a much more pleasurable alternative. I mean, and it was like really like you were there, you upgrade your equipment, all the senses, and it's like it beat reality in
Yes.
terms of pleasure and enjoyability and comfort and cognitive stimulation, because the real world sucked.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I remember I did an interview with, I don't know if you ever heard of this guy, Myron Kruger. One of the early guys in the 80s built a thing called Video Place, which was a precursor to interactive graphic stuff. And I got to interview him in 2000. And I said, do you think people will get addicted to VR? And he goes, no, it's not good enough. Well, 20
It
years
is now.
later, it's getting, it's moving along. And I'm actually going to do an interview with him in the next month. He's an old guy now, but he's still vibrant as hell. But I want to ask him that question again, because it is getting better. And certainly in Ready Player One, you had the full blown image of, virtual reality as that completely immersive and suspension of disbelief. So maybe that puts the onus on us to make the real world better. The overuse of VR may be a reaction to how shitty we've made the real world, and we need to put more attention. Now, that's a very idealistic notion. So to unpack that next level, we got to say, well, um, yes, there are people that don't have relationships in the real world. There are people with autism that have difficulty with relationships. When Second Life first started to have its heyday, there was an island that was specifically for people with autism. It was called Brigadoon, and people were kind of having concerns like, oh, this is great. Now you're going to have people with autism never go out in the real world and interact with people. They're just going to do it in the Second Life metaverse thing, because they really flocked to it. It was really a successful experiment. And it unlocked an element to them. So my answer to them was, well, what would these folks be doing if they weren't in Second Life in Brigadoon? Would they be playing video games? Would they be self-stimming? Would they just be watching TV for 7 hours a day? At least by providing that opportunity for some kind of connectedness, although mediated through an avatar, there's still a human mind on the other side of that avatar. Maybe that's a stepping stone to make it so it'd be easier going in the outside world. Now, we've shown this with autism, with job interview training, with virtual job interviewers that put you through your paces, variety of characters, different job backdrops, and each character can be nice, neutral, or nasty. And we put people through their paces, and we find that folks on the spectrum have a more engaged interaction with these virtual characters, and they'll do it in a way they wouldn't role play with a vocational counselor. And that repeated practice makes them feel more comfortable to have that interview at the end of the trial with the vocational counselor. That again, that interaction with synthetic character
Yeah.
transfers to the real world. So my view on the metaverse, yeah, we got to watch out. We got to make the real world compete with the metaverse, because metaverse coming on strong. It will come on strong. But along the way, let's think about the metaverse as a way to break down barriers to care, to bring people together, and to give them practice in a way to interact that might benefit and create a better appreciation for their life in the real world. When you think about, I don't know if the metaverse is going to fully overtake reality, because the sense of touch, that's always been the wild card,
Hmm.
that in Ready Player One, yeah, you have these suits, always the
Right.
vision of the future, you're getting full haptic feedback. But the feelings of your skin, this massive sensory organ that you're encased in, it's hard to beat the feeling of sand between your toes at the beach. You can be in the most perfect virtual beach, but the smell of the salt water and the ability to jump in the water. So maybe we'll come to a point where, yeah, we'll spend a lot more time in these
Hmm.
simulations, but
Right.
maybe kids will go, take off the headset and go, Mom, when can we go to a real beach? I
Right.
want to go to a forest and see a real bird flying.
Right.
Will there be that kind of a rebound when the limitations of the metaverse become more
You know,
obvious?
I think, I think that it's very easy to become either side, which is, oh, the metaverse is going to answer all of our problems, it's going to be fantastic, blah, blah, blah. Or at the other side to become the Luddite and say, this is going to be horrible for our children, our children's children. Um, and my youngest granddaughter presently is 18 months old. And I wonder, like my second youngest is 11, and I'm like, well, she'll never drive because she'll never need to learn to drive. She's 11 today. By the time she's old enough to drive, all cars will be, or most cars will be self-driving, and driving tests would be stupid. And buying a car and paying insurance, that's just dumb. I get it. Okay. But my younger granddaughter, who is now Generation Alpha, she's not even Z, she's Generation Alpha. I wonder how much time she'll spend in the real world versus in a virtual world. But I don't think that either side of that argument is the absolute argument. I think, as your work is proving, there is extraordinary value in accessing these tools as tools. So, as you said, somebody with autism who would never role play an interview with a real person just can't do it, but be in the metaverse and do it and develop. And I think this is the other thing, is that to remember that while I'm in there, if there's a learning, that learning transfers to the real world. And I think that that's often what people forget. It's easier for me to pick up chicks in the metaverse. I'm terrified and I'm very shy. Okay, but if you pick up chicks in the metaverse enough, there's going to be a time when you're in a coffee shop in a real world and you'll go, I can talk to that girl, because you've now built the neural pathways that say, I could do it. I've faced rejection in that. It's already in place. So I think that that's the piece we forget, is we make the world separate and we forget that the learning is the bridge that joins them both. So if you're learning the real world, you can take that into the metaverse. If you learn the metaverse, you can take that into the real world. Is that a good way of understanding it?
I think that's spot on. I mean, that's why we use simulation to train pilots and how to deal with wind shear and fog landings. Would you prefer that they learn that out of a book or a death by PowerPoint lecture? No,
Right.
you
And
put,
I certainly don't prefer that they learn it while I'm in the plane.
yeah, on the job training. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'll tell you that. I've been on the job 2 weeks now. Okay, I'll come back in a couple of years. Thanks. Good, good, good.
you
Yeah.
know
So,
Maybe we're going to evolve in a way that might be abhorrent to 20th century people, but it's going to be the natural ebb and flow of what the environment affords for us. I remember when I got my first Hewlett Packard calculator, Believe it or not, I actually did a semester of engineering. I was going to be an engineer at one point. I had this tricked out calculator, and people were saying, this might be helpful for your education, using it for these complex things you have to do in engineering. But when kids have these calculators, they're going to lose the ability to do math. They're not going to be
Hmm.
able to add or balance their checkbook. And it's like, well, we don't have a generation of people that don't know how to add any worse than 60 years
Yeah.
ago. But we also
Yeah.
have productivity tools that will balance our checkbook, that will do our math in ways, but we still have great mathematicians coming out and people
Hmm.
developing algorithms. So, I think blaming the tool is sometimes an
It's
easy
easy.
way out.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a very, very good point. For me, the fascinating piece around this conversation with you and I is that we're both from the quote soft skills world, you know, and this whole VR thing is a hard skills engineering application to that. And I think it's part of where those things bump into each other. They just go, "Oh, I can't make those things work." But it's understanding how those two things so come together that allows us to go, yeah, let's not be the luddite here, but let's not be the technocrat who wants to get away from emotional reality. Because what you and I are talking about here, because we talked about this in the context of leadership, you're trying to train somebody in a leadership skill. One of the things you talked about is, well, I'm the CEO, so I'm not going to have that conversation. I'm going to get HR to have that conversation, so I don't have to bother. But you were talking about how powerful this can be for even leadership training in helping us to have quote difficult conversations.
I think this is an area that's been addressed in the medical field. I mean, how do you give, difficult information to a family member about terminal illness, conveying difficult information to patients, but it's the same thing in leadership. Certainly every decision, I mean, when you're at a high level of leadership, you're making the decisions as, who said this, what president said this, that by the time it comes to my desk, nobody else could make that decision. And I have to make the
Right.
hard decision.
Yep.
And that's part of leadership, and making those decisions in an informed way, but also communicating them in a way that it still inspires people or gets people motivated to do some of the hard things that are often required. That's a talent that if you don't have it in good leadership, then you're that boss,
Mm-hmm.
you
As
know,
opposed to a leader,
uh,
yeah.
yeah, and so you know people are developing these kinds of role play training, just like I said with the autism application, and we're doing it with justice involved youth, with conflict resolution, with virtual characters, avatars, basically driven by coaches and stuff, and giving people the opportunity to practice, how they would deliver an assertive response rather than an aggressive response, how they would reframe something that initially sounds terrible, but reframing it in a way that makes sense to everybody,
Mm-hmm.
rather than being authoritarian, you're doing it or there's the door. So I think good leadership is going to benefit from this kind of role play training if it's adopted. A lot of times, bad leaders think they're the best leaders. That's the problem, and they might not
I have
engage in
no idea
this
what you mean.
stuff.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
Uh,
Like I said, we both sort of come from the background of being the sit down therapist. What was the turning point for you? What made you go, we need something better?
oh man, it was patient inspired. I was working in brain injury rehab, and this was in the late 80s, early 90s. And these are folks like you or me. One day they have a car accident, a stroke, post surgical cognitive impairment. Now they're trying to recover their cognitive functioning. Basic in a lot of ways, maintaining attention, alternating attention, memory encoding, executive function, all that. Um, and the tools that we had back then were a lot paper and pencil workbook exercises, critical thinking exercises, and they were just weren't engaging at all. One day, one of my clients, 22-year-old um, male, had a car accident, frontal lobe injuries, hard to stay focused on a task for more than 5-10 minutes. Comes into my office and goes, Skip, have you seen this? I go, what is it? He goes, it's a new thing. It's called a Game Boy. And I go, what does it do? And he says, watch. And I'm looking over his shoulder and I'm watching him. He's playing Tetris. And I'm watching him for now like 10, 15 minutes, glued to this thing, not only engaged with it, but he was good at it. He was like a Tetris warlord. And it was like, if I could bottle that process
Mm,
into a cognitive rehab activity that would do the same thing, but for a higher level, other than twitch speed
mm-hmm.
and sensory motor, visual spatial stuff, which Tetris would work. But things that would help people move on from their TBI into the best they can be, then I'd be all set. So I started bringing in games, like Nintendo games. I had
Mm,
NES system, and my mom got it for me. I don't know why she bought it for me for Christmas, but I got that one year, and it had Sim City with it. And
right.
Sim City is really
It's
back
the
then. I haven't
beginning of the
played it.
metaverse.
Yeah, and it was like, you have to use your executive functions to plan, make decisions in real time as the city evolves, change the tax rate, bring in industry, put in an airport, but don't wreck the environment. And when they could learn the interface, this was a challenge, learning the Nintendo gamepad. They, the ones that could learn the interface, grooved. We had competitions who could build the best city and within a 5-year time frame, with the clock running and all. And I thought it was a really good engaging activity, but the interface sucked. Then I heard Jaron Lanier talk about this virtual kitchen that, was a commercial thing in Japan, where you could select your appliances, change the color with the data glove, move them around. And that's when it all clicked. It was like, we can build these simulations of real world environments. We can bring in gaming elements to make them motivating and engage people. And that will change the face of cognitive assessment, as well as the area I was focused on, cognitive rehab. And the final part of the story, I don't want to just tell you all these old man stories, but the final part was, after I'd heard that on NPR, that Jaron Lanier piece, the next day I go to my boss. I went to a bookstore right after and bought a book on VR and stayed up most of the night reading it. But I went to my boss the next day and I go, I think there's something to this VR thing. I want to explore this further. And she goes, that's funny. I just got this flyer in the mail. It's a conference called Virtual Reality in Persons with Disabilities. This is 93. And she goes, if you want to go, I think we have the funding. We can send you and you can see what it's about. And it was like, oh, and I met Walter Greenleaf at that event, Dean Inman, Ray Bradbury gave
Ray
the
Bradbury.
keynote.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. And that was the start of it for me. I never looked back. And a year and a half later, I ended up taking a postdoc at USC to build a lab in VR. And my postdoc was in Alzheimer's work, because I could
Right.
transfer TBI to Alzheimer's. But across the street from the Alzheimer's Center was the computer science department. I went over there and bugged people, cold call, knocking on doors of people that I looked up that had, some VR or interest in gaming, whatever. And one guy opened his door one day and said, and I laid out some ideas, and he goes, I know somebody that has some equipment and I can get you a student programmer. And that was the start of it. I
Wow.
started building it out, visual spatial things on projection systems, and virtual classrooms for testing kids with ADHD. And in the 90s, still using a Silicon Graphics reality engine, about 250 grand a clip, but after 2000, then you could start to do it on a PC. But anyway, that's my
So
long story.
we're coming to the end of the show here, and I really, I mean, I want you to be a little bit prophetic, if you would. and prescriptive too. What do you think that we in the leadership world, and when I say leadership, I'm not talking about just in business. I mean, it might be political leadership, it might be, it could be manufacturing, it could be, whatever it might be, right? Even medical. Um, what do you think like what would be your prescription for us? What do you think, thinking about prophetically about where we're going, what do we need to do, we as leaders need to do to really embrace where this is all going, to make it work and make us all better?
You
I
know,
know it's a tough question, but
yeah. The first thing that pops into my head is the keeping your empathy alive. A lot of times, as people rise up different levels of achievement,
mm,
uh, they're not as empathetic for the people that they necessarily have to rely on to
mm-hmm,
accomplish a mission. And having empathy for what motivates other people and how they feel in certain circumstances, I think that's a core process for success, um, and that for anybody, but in
mm-hmm.
leadership, I think it's especially important. So, and there are a ton of these types of applications that put you in the shoes of another person,
Of course.
whether it's a homeless person or it's a person with Alzheimer's or schizophrenia. These are all apps people have built. Um, and maybe there's a direction that could be pursued in that way, um, but also it comes down to, again, the meat and potatoes role play practice, of how to communicate a message, how to communicate it authentically. Can you train that, or does that rely on the empathy? Does it rely on being idealistic while also maintaining your pragmatic reality?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, leadership is such a complex issue, and
Yes.
a lot of times it's easy to point to, like we were saying before, about the charismatic leader that inspires people. But there's a lot of leaders that don't have that, but still reach a certain level where they can still accomplish things. So, what are those functional skills for doing that? Short of being the natural born leader, not everybody's going to reach that level.
Well, I think
But
you just said something really important, which is, charismatic is one thing, um, but there's a lot of charismatic assholes, right? And certainly they may get people to do things because they're charismatic, but real loyalty to something that matters, that comes from deep empathy and compassion. Uh, um, and if you can mix that with some charisma, great. But if you don't actually have to, you don't have to be charismatic to do that. You have to actually give a crap about people and they need to know that you genuinely care. Maya Angelou said, everybody knows the quote, but uh, it's not what you get people to do; it's how you make them feel about themselves, right? And that I know it's a bad version of the quote, but
right,
that's what it is. It's how do they feel about themselves after their interaction with you, and if you are narcissistic, charismatic, it's how do you feel about me now that I've interacted with you, versus how do you feel about you, and that's a vastly different thing, and that is the key to leadership. And again, I believe that empathy training is going to be a big part of VR, virtual reality training. And it seems, for me, it seems like the most counterintuitive because it is so human. But, and again, I fully agree with what you said in part one. The, these are transitional. This is a way to practice the skill so that you can take it into the real world, transition it into the real world, and become a better, more whole, more actualized human being. Skip, this has been a pleasure and an honor, sir. Thank you so much. I know you're a busy lad, and I really appreciate you coming and having this chat with us and sharing your wisdom with the audience. Again, please make sure that everybody knows out, find out about you, about your resources, and about how they can be part of all the amazing things that you're up to?
Yeah. Basically, look me up at the USC Institute for Creative Technologies. You have my email address, rizzo@ict.usc.edu. I try to follow up as best I can, and my YouTube channel, Albert Skip Rizzo. Just punch that in, it'll turn up, and I get around. I do a few talks, and I consult with a number of different companies, and sometimes some of my academic work is directly relevant to a query, but other times I can maybe point in a direction of, a company that's doing something that's relevant for your needs, or a company I know of.
Yes.
So yeah, feel free to reach out.
As you said, I think there's enormous applications for this in the leadership space and for the training space. And I think it'd be well worth really great leaders reaching out to you and just look, even to have a conversation about the potential of this in their world. So again, Skip, it's been a pleasure, mate. Thank you so much. And for you to listen, remember that you can hang out with other conscious leaders. You can chat about this episode or any past episodes inside of our Facebook and LinkedIn groups. Just look for the Leadership and Loyalty podcast. I am Dov Baron. I show businesses, teams, and leaders how to harness their emotional source code to move their tribe. Because unified actualized meaning is the one single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for all individuals and companies. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friends, stay curious about the future technology that you fear that actually may be the very thing you need to become a better leader, a more connected, a more empathetic leader. I'm Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your deepest possible meaning to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business and in your life and in your leadership impact. Because those who control the meaning control the movement of the group. I'm Dov Baron, and I am out.